Welcome to this lecture of Radboud Reflects, this program of today, The History of Morality, which we've organized in collaboration with the Germany Institute. Tonight we'll be talking with Hanno Sauer and Marc Slors. I will briefly introduce them. Hanno Sauer is a philosopher and he teaches ethics at Utrecht University. And he leads a European research project on moral progress. He previously published Moral Thinking, Fast and Slow, and his latest book is Morality, Good and Evil, from Prehistory to Polarization, which is mainly what we will be talking about today. Marc Slors, our second speaker, is a professor of cognitive philosophy at our own Radboud University, and his current research focuses on the relationship between cognition and culture. And his previous work is focused on the philosophy of neuroscience, free will, social cognition, and the self. My name is Sarah Boter. I will be the moderator of today. I will briefly go through the setup of the evening, because first we will listen to a lecture by Hanno Sauer, and then I will have a conversation with both speakers here on the stage. And at the end, there will also be time for questions from the audience. I'd like to give a great applause to Hanno Sauer.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all. It's a gorgeous venue, an unusual venue that I'm very happy to be speaking in, and it's lovely that there's such a great turnout, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to this fascinating program that I received, and I'm really looking forward both to our conversation with Marc Slors, but also your questions after that, and I'll just try to give you an introduction to the book that is as concise as I can make it. I'm not going to present any deep arguments. It's just going to be basically an overview of the themes that I'm touching upon in the book. And it is, in a way, a world history of morality. It's a book that's trying to tell the story of where our morals come from, where our norms and values and social practices and morally charged institutions come from. And in a sense, the book stands in an important modern tradition in philosophy, which basically started or became especially prominent with Friedrich Nietzsche, and that project is often referred to as the genealogy of morals. The idea is that we don't do moral philosophy, as people sometimes say, from the armchair. We're not trying to derive moral principles from reason. We're not trying to get our moral principles from revelation. We don't find them ready-made, so to speak, and we just follow them and accept their authority. But we are asking the question of what is the origin of our moral norms and values? And in particular, that question is supposed to be a normative question. So it's not just a question of where do these values in fact come from? But the real interest ultimately is, can we tell a story about the origin of our moral rules and principles and attitudes and emotions, and will we still like these moral norms and values and principles and institutions after we've heard that story? Or will these values then appear dubious and suspect and unjustified and ugly to us? Or will they still appear to make sense and be justified? Will they be vindicated by that kind of story that we tell? And the way that I set up this story in the book is to organize the material in these main moral transformations that humanity has undergone. Humanity both understood as a biological species, but also as a cultural group and a social arrangement. And the structure that I came up with in the book is to identify these 7 main moral transformations that follow this kind of temporal logic, starting 5 million years ago with our pre-human, not yet human ancestors, 500,000 years ago, 50,000, 5,000, 500, 50 and 5. And with the 5 years ago chapter, we've sort of arrived in the present. And ultimately, that whole story is not just supposed to be, la polar. It's not just, for its own sake, but it's supposed to yield or make an attempt at yielding, ultimately, a kind of diagnosis of the present. It's supposed to offer a kind of characterization of what is significant and interesting and distinctive of our current moment and the moral fabric of society that we all inhabit and occupy. And in my experience, that is something that pretty much everyone is really interested in. When you go to like a dinner party, at a certain point in time, you start talking about these things. What is the relevance of social group identity, for instance? How should we deal with social inequality and hierarchy and oppression? What are the limits of the sayable? Right? How should we address each other? How should we talk with each other? How should we talk about each other? How should we treat each other? Right? All of these questions at some point come up, and there's lots of disagreement also about these sorts of questions. And I try to tell a story that can provide at least some degree of orientation about the origin of all these concepts and how and if and to what extent they are applicable in modern society. This is the book in the Dutch translation with, I think, a very, very good subtitle, Goed en Kwaad van prehistorie tot polarisatie. And these are the chapter titles, but the main themes that I address in each of these chapters can be summed up with these slogans, so to speak: cooperation, punishment, culture, hierarchy, individualism, inclusion, and identity. And so it's supposed to start from the very origins of cooperation. Why and how does cooperation between humans emerge in the first place? And then there are all these other mechanisms that shape the transformations of human society and human morality over the course of our existence. And I don't really go that much into these definitional questions, like what is morality, for instance. We all have a kind of pre-theoretical, pre-reflective understanding of what morality and norms and values are about. I like to say that morality is our normative infrastructure, is the kinds of rules and values and practices and rituals and institutions that we deploy to organize our social life together, and we can tell a story about how this normative infrastructure has developed and changed in a way that also interacts with technological development, economic development, scientific innovation, and so on and so on. And you see that this is a temporal order from the past to the present, but a big theme that also runs through the whole book is what is sometimes, in technical terms, referred to as the scalability of cooperative structures. It is, in fact, a big puzzle still right now how we explain that basically the same kind of being that was already around 100,000 years ago, how that kind of being can live so differently today, how we can organize this sort of stuff, build this kind of building, organize and run these kinds of events, cooperate on a larger and larger scale, economically, politically, and so on and so on and so on. And so that's a big theme. How do we explain how morality contributes towards the scaling up of human society over the course of its history, from very small groups of 10, 20, 30 individuals up until the present, where we have basically billions of people interacting with each other who do not know each other, perfect strangers to each other, will never know each other, will never see each other, don't even know that they exist. And that's a big theme in this whole book. And now I'll just try to give you a very, very brief idea of what happens in the book. I tried to make it good, but also, well, good in the sense of also readable and accessible. So I try to, walk that line between something that doesn't compromise too much on scholarly rigor and conceptual sophistication and empirical evidence and empirical support, while at the same time also being readable and written in a way that brings in some world and content and stories and anecdotes to illustrate all these concepts that play a role in the book. So the first topic that plays a huge role is just cooperation as such. We all think that cooperation is kind of the obvious option because we are built that way, right? We are sort of made in a way that we don't see how difficult it actually is to explain how cooperation is possible. Because, of course, we all face all the time so-called problems of collective action. Just means that it's usually in anyone's interest to deviate from cooperation, to deviate and not contribute towards the common good, but to benefit from cooperation, but not do anything ourselves. Since that applies to everyone equally, to each and every individual, cooperation becomes very unstable, and you need to come up with an explanation of what the mechanisms are that stabilize cooperation for beings like us that can, in principle, deviate from it. And one big insight that comes from these attempts to explain how cooperation got off the ground in the first place is that it had to remain restricted to very small groups, right? So basically we inherited, again, I'm speaking, coarsely and roughly, but we have pre-installed in our brain a psychology that is adapted to life in very small groups, because otherwise you couldn't have the benefits of cooperation emerge. Once groups become too large, at least in the first instance, cooperation becomes unstable and it needs to be restricted to very small groups, basically to groups of individuals that are genetically very deeply related, right? We all care about family members, especially kids and siblings and so on and so on. And also remains restricted to chains of reciprocity. So you help me, I help you, you scratch my back, I scratch your back, and we are bound up in these chains of reciprocal cooperation over time. But we can see right away why these mechanisms are not very scalable, because once a group becomes too large, people aren't so deeply genetically related anymore, and also the bookkeeping for that kind of reciprocity becomes very, very difficult to track, right? You don't know who helped me yesterday, and so on and so on. So it becomes very, very difficult to build groups, even of a couple hundred people, on the basis of these mechanisms. So you need something else to stabilize cooperation further in order to be able to grow. And the groups that did figure out how that works, they were the ones that kind of made it through that next filter. That brings us to the topic of punishment, because punishment is another important mechanism that, beyond kinship, relatedness and reciprocity, stabilizes cooperation further. Once people start punishing other people for their transgressions and for their wrongdoing and for their antisocial behavior, you have an extra incentive to stay in line and to not deviate from these cooperative arrangements. And this has two effects. First of all, the immediate effect is that when you start punishing individuals that transgress and behave wrongly, you change the incentives, and you then have an incentive to stay in line and to behave. But also, the evidence that we now have suggests that has kicked off a very, very long process of so-called self-domestication. So basically what we did is that we formed these small coalitions in small groups, in the small groups that we lived in, and the most impulsive, the most aggressive, the most tyrannical, the most undisciplined bullies were killed, were murdered. Because once you learn how to cooperate for the good, you have thereby also learned how to cooperate in terms of performing violent acts. And when you do that a couple 100,000 years, always take out the most aggressive members of your society, you have a kind of domestication process that we have inflicted upon ourselves that is a very, very powerful filter in terms of, in a direction of friendliness, conformity, cooperativeness, impulse control, and discipline. And we are basically the result of that. We are basically the golden retriever to a wolf, and we have done that ourselves. That's no one else did that, right? But we have engaged in practices to compress aggression and non-conformity that has made us, to a large extent, who we are. So we have these two effects. One, when you punish someone, you change the equation. It becomes less profitable, so to speak, to try to get away with stuff. But also when you engage in that kind of very drastic capital punishment, so to speak, but informally, right, at night with a spear, you kick off that process of self-domestication. And that, again, is something that stabilizes cooperation even further, because when you want to build a larger group, there's going to be much more pressure when you have all these impulsive individuals in the group. And when you have people that are more controlled and more peaceful and more domesticated, you have an easier time reaching the next level of moral evolution, so to speak. Now, next level doesn't mean that there is any plan behind this, right? It doesn't mean that there's any direction this is taking. These are all selection mechanisms. It's just some people and some groups happened to start doing these things, and as a result, that was the effect that we observe. So there's no grand plan behind it. There's no intelligent design. There's no vision. It's purely a selection effect that has been kicked off by engaging in these practices that then, in hindsight, turned out to work a certain way that allowed us to build these larger and larger groups. A third factor has to do with a term that is 200-something years old, a German word that was coined at the time for this phenomenon, namely Mängelwesen. Mängelwesen means something like a deficient being, a being with deficits. And it's been noted very, very often that we have poor instincts. Right? We take a long time to grow up. We are very dependent, very vulnerable. We have no skills, no knowledge. We need to learn it all, right? First 10, 15 years of your life, you are utterly useless, just a drag on society. You contribute nothing. You just need to learn all the stuff that's important and valuable for society over the course of your upbringing, because we don't have these skills pre-installed like a horse that just gets up and after a couple of hours and it's just like, done, right? It's a horse. In order to become a human being, it takes years of, becoming that kind of individual that's capable of language, following rules, understanding different perspectives, and so on and so on. And that's something that is really unique in the animal kingdom, because we don't just have that cultural reservoir of skills and knowledge that we can download each generation after another, but we also have the capacity to build cumulative culture. So we can modify and improve our cultural inheritance that we have received from the previous generation. And no other animal can really do that. Certainly nowhere near the extent that we are engaging in it. And indeed, that kind of building, we couldn't build that we couldn't acquire the knowledge if it were lost within a generation. It needs to be nurtured and cultivated in order to be around, downloaded by the next generation, and then slightly modified and improved. And that also means that, and this is an interesting feature, that also means that much of human society is intransparent to us. It's opaque to us. We don't really understand how it works, right? That's why we can't export it, for instance. We can't go to a place and make it like the Netherlands, right? That needs to grow over time. You can't just tell people, okay, now do democracy. Right? Because these kinds of institutions and the values and norms and the knowledge and the skills that are required to do that, I'm not saying that that has to be the goal, but if you were to try it, that wouldn't work because it needs to grow over generations. And we don't really understand how it works. And you see many examples of culture being intransparent like that. And that at the same time makes us very dependent upon trusting other individuals to engage in social learning. And we become increasingly dependent on people around us, parents, grandparents, friends, peers, anyone that we can learn something from. Now, This is a big step because nowadays we live in societies where it's not that we like it, but we are pretty used to the fact that we live in societies that are grossly unequal, grossly hierarchical. There are enormous differences in wealth and power, and there is an enormous degree of social stratification. We think that the evidence suggests now that for the longest time that wasn't the case. Inequality in small groups used to be pretty low. There used to be some division of labor, for instance, but there wasn't even a lot of gender inequality. There wasn't a lot of political inequality. There was no little material inequality, because when you don't have a surplus of wealth that you accumulate over time, there is nothing to be unequal in your society. So at a certain point in time, at some point after the so-called Neolithic revolution, and then kicking off roughly 5,000 years ago, we see these hugely unequal societies emerge for the first time. And these societies have been described by Jared Diamond, a famous anthropologist, as the worst mistake of all time, the worst mistake of humanity of all time, because that kind of transition from the harmonious, bucolic, sort of egalitarian life in small groups, that was replaced by pretty large societies with thousands, 10,000s, maybe 50, maybe 100,000 members, with huge inequality and oppression. For the first time, this was also, not for the first time in this sense, but you also had, for the first time, a need to legitimize oppressions. So you had a caste of priests and intellectuals and theologians that would come up with an explanation for why this is all good and right, that some people live in riches and the vast majority of the rest of society is toiling in the field, is being oppressed, exploited, usually enslaved, and they had dreadful lives with lots of disease due to proximity to animal life. And that kind of society, on the one hand, it's in a way an inevitable step in social evolution, maybe not inevitable, but it was bound to happen. Sort of, but because once you have cultural beings that can come up with new ways of living together, you also have, once the climate starts being right in certain places, say in Mesopotamia or something, you have, for the first time in human history, these conditions that allow the creation of an economic surplus. That then gets appropriated disproportionately by small groups in society. Elites start to form. The people that protect these elites ideologically and with violence start to form. And that is basically the kind of society that we have lived in since then. Right? Basically a kind of feudal society where you have a tiny elite that owns the land and the resources and controls the military power. They wiped out everyone else. They were either annihilated or absorbed into these types of societies, usually against their will. Right? And that is the kind of society that, by and large, we still live in. And it's a pretty recent attempt, and a very much an imperfect attempt, but at least an attempt to re-energize this desire to live in a more egalitarian society. Recently, there's been a book that's pretty well known by David Graeber and David Wengrow. It's called The Dawn of Everything, where they try to address this question: is that really inevitable? Are we really stuck, if we want to have large societies with economic growth and all the fixings, all the gadgets and the nice stuff, right? Do we really need to accept this type of drastic material hierarchy and economic inequality? And it may very well be that we are in some sense stuck, as long as we don't want to return to, a kind of camping trip society of 50 people. We may well be stuck with that kind of inequality and hierarchy, which is not to say that it's justified. It's just that we don't really know any other way of running large societies without huge inequality and oppression and hierarchy. Now, a lot of people also wonder, after that, how did we move from that type of hierarchical society into what we may refer to as the modern world? There are different explanations that have been proposed. some very dubious and nefarious, racist explanations. Perhaps it happened in some places that economic growth started and scientific innovation started because a certain type of people was capable of that and the rest aren't. We now know that that is not true, but still the question is, how come that we have this emergence of modern societies with democratic participation, with markets, with normative individualism, so the idea that people are individuals that have rights, that can shape their own lives as they see fit. Again, all of this is very much imperfect and not available to everyone, certainly not equally, but at least that's the idea, that's the normative fabric of society that we live in. And I can only sketch this very briefly, but there have been a couple of explanations, and I think by far the best explanation for how this happened is a very recent one that has been proposed by Joseph Henrik and people around Joseph Henrik, a Canadian professor who's working in the US, and he wrote a book that's called The Weirdest People in the World. And by the weirdest people in the world, he means you. Because WEIRD is an acronym that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. And here the idea is that the weirdest people in the world, they came from a very counterintuitive process that no one has proposed before. Basically, the idea is that sometime in the early Middle Ages, and we are at a Catholic university, I've been told, what we would now refer to as the Catholic Church, but then it was you could call it the Western Church, Western Christianity in Western and Central Europe, for some reason started to destroy the kinship structures that were prevalent in Europe as anywhere else, and started to ban cousin marriage, for instance. And started to change inheritance rules to break up large families and continuous families. So kinship, as the fundamental organizing principle of society, was replaced by, at first, nothing, but it created a vacuum, of course, for other institutions to grow that were based not on blood, but on voluntary participation. So you get monasteries, you get universities, you get corporations, you get cities, you get markets, and at a certain point in time, people also start to think that our political community should be based on voluntary consent. That's where you get the idea that there is a social contract, that there should be a social contract from. A very, very alien idea for almost all of human history, that society should be a contract, because evidently it isn't, right? No one's ever signed one. Didn't happen, right? But it's just this idea that society should be structured and run in such a way that, in principle, people could agree to joining it, right? Which is evidently not the case in these societies. And people, in fact, very much did not agree. They had to be forced, and if they didn't agree to it, they were killed. So the destruction of kinship structures as the fundamental organizing principle in Western Europe probably brought about that kind of vacuum that led to the cultural evolution of a set of institutions that then, after 1,000 or 1,500 years, ushered in modernity and modern economic growth with all its benefits and all its horrors. So it's not supposed to be some sort of triumphalist story where the West kind of stumbled upon the right way of living. It's just, this is what in fact happened. And as it turns out, it leads to institutions that facilitate a kind of economic growth that we haven't seen before. And then just very briefly, in the final two chapters, here I try to describe what I think are the main lessons of the 20th century. One thing is that it's a bad idea to double down on our us-them psychology, right? So in a way, Nazi Germany and many other attempts in the 20th century can be seen as yet another attempt to intensify group divisions on the basis of ethnic belonging and racial categorization, supposed racial categorization, Aryans and Jews, whatever you want. Right? Group membership was really highlighted as the thing that matters. This people against that people. And the expanding circle of moral status is the idea that is not good. That leads into, that's very risky, can often lead into catastrophe and group antagonism and warfare and violence. And it's much better to draw a wider circle of moral status where everyone is equally worthy of moral consideration, regardless of ethnicity, skin color, racial membership, whatever that is. And another famous big insight, I think, was the so-called banality of evil, a genius phrase coined by Hannah Arendt in her reports on the trials of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is the idea that you don't need much. In fact, you need very, very, very little to get people to do very bad things. Usually, you can just tell them. You can just say, okay, you go out and you murder these people, and people do it, right? And it doesn't take special people. It just takes a little bit of peer pressure and habit, and you get that to happen. You don't need evil people to do evil things. And so much of the 20th century has been dedicated to this attempt to build institutions that preempt that from happening. Again, very much imperfect, doesn't always work, but I think there's a great consciousness that moral regress and catastrophe is only ever a step away, and we should be very wary of that happening again, and our us-them psychology being reactivated to produce these kinds of violent and terrible effects. And then in the final chapter, I try to offer a diagnosis and some hypotheses about what is characteristic of the current moment. I think we see, like I said in the beginning, that concepts such as group identity have been revitalized in the context of marginalization and oppression and discrimination and disadvantage. We see that the main promise of modernity, that everyone would be equal and would have equality of opportunity, and that your skin color isn't supposed to matter for how your life goes, that your sexual orientation isn't supposed to matter for how your life goes, that your gender isn't supposed to matter for how your life goes, that has not been fully realized in modern society. And there have been different social movements that try to deal with that fact and to really implement these emancipatory values that sort of are built into the normative infrastructure of modern societies. And then at the same time, you also get various problematic effects that people take that kind of good idea into an excessive direction, and then they start policing what costumes people wear, and they start to say, you can't say unhoused anymore, you need to say housing deprived, stuff like that, right? So that can all turn, like a very serious attempt based on good ideas can turn into a largely symbolic struggle that is of more dubious value. I'm not saying that it's all bad, but it can lead to certain types of undesirable effects and be either effective or put people off, and so on and so on. At the same time, what I want to say ultimately is I think there is a way out. I think there's empirical evidence suggesting two things. One is that polarization is usually driven by extreme voices and is overrated. And at the same time, there's really good empirical evidence that how many moral values we share and the depth of that shared moral heritage is really underestimated. We've all been sold to some extent on this relativist idea that values are not something that we can rationally talk about and that are all different in different places in the world. I think that idea is basically empirically false. So I think there's much more potential for reasonable discourse, for mutual understanding than we think when we look at the media, and I try to come up with that kind of optimistic message towards the end of the book. Thank you.
You can take a seat at the conversation chairs. Thank you very much for your lecture. Marc, as a professor of cognitive philosophy, how do you look at this talk? What strikes you?
Oh, there's so much that strikes me. So one of the things that strikes me is that I don't work on morality and ethics, and I have never thought that I would be basically sitting here but we use the same kind of literature.
Yeah.
So I work in cultural and cognition. I do a lot with cultural evolution, and I really like your book. So
Thank you.
buy the book, read the book. It's really worth it.
Buying is important.
No, the reading. Yeah, I find the reading important. So how do I look at it? I have lots of questions, and I don't know which one to start with. But let's start with this one. So your book is a history of morality, and as a history, it explains the emergence of morality. It explains the emergence of human collaboration, so-called pro-sociality, people being nice to each other. It explains the emergence of moral rules, moral norms, moral institutions, and it explains transformations in those moral norms. How does explanation square with justification? So now we're in the situation in which we have certain moral values, we have certain moral standards, moral norms, and we tend to think that our moral norms are justified. I want to talk about relativism like in 2 minutes, because I'm not convinced of this 99.9%. But how does explaining morality square with justifying your moral reasons?
Yeah.
Because I tend to think, okay, when I read your book, I'm completely convinced. I know this literature well. I think it's really informative and explains a lot about how we have come to be the way we are. But we tend to think that we do things for reasons that are justified rather than simple explanations of, okay, this made us, evolutionarily successful.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
How does that work?
That is a question that I struggled with a lot, because it's basically a kind of philosophy 101 mistake that you want to get. You don't want to get caught making, right? Yeah. You don't want to get caught making that mistake to confuse what is the case with what ought to be the case. Right. That is sometimes called, Hume's law, after a famous philosopher who said that, one thing is to describe the world and to state what is actually the case, and it's an entirely different language game to say this is what ought to be the case, or this is what's desirable, this is what's good, this is what's morally recommended. And whenever anyone goes into that territory of empirically, descriptively, causally explaining some phenomenon that from the inside looks normative, like something that is right and wrong going on there is that danger of conflating is and ought and making that mistake. It's also sometimes referred to as the genetic fallacy. Genetic not meaning biological genes, but where something comes from doesn't tell you how good it is. Right? Something can have horrible origins, but maybe it's a good idea, right? Maybe you had a really terrible person came up with penicillin, or maybe you had a really good person who never came up with anything interesting, right? It just has no bearing on the quality of beliefs and so on and so on. So that's something that I struggled with a lot, and I wanted to make sure that at least I'm not committing this mistake in any obvious sort of way. I'm hiding it a bit, but it's in there. It's definitely in there. I think what I'm trying to do is I think these two perspectives don't really intermingle. On the one hand, we can provide a naturalistic, a normal scientific explanation of where we come from as a species, how society works, why it works the way that it works. But that doesn't replace the normative categories such as right and wrong, desirable or undesirable. But these are categories that we use as participants in this society. So when we look at it from the outside, we see, this is what happened. The Catholic Church did this and that. And from the inside, we become, we adopt a totally different perspective where we start to appreciate the reasons internal to that kind of practice. It's a little bit like you can, on the one hand, explain where chess comes from, but when you're playing it, you appreciate the rules as something that is reason giving for which moves that you are permitted to make. And I think these two perspectives I did my best. You are right that there is that danger, but I did my best to sort of keep them separate and to make sure that I tell a story that's empirically and scientifically plausible. And then at the same time, once I move, because I do that a lot, once I move towards, oh, this seems like a good idea, this seems like a bad idea, I try to operate with the reasons that are available to us internally as participants in that practice, the emergence of which I have just described from the outside. That's basically the idea.
This is really not meant as a criticism, but it's meant as an observation that this is probably a problem that you cannot really avoid, right? So even if you are playing your game of chess. Yeah. Even if you're thinking about moral issues and you're thinking, okay, I believe this is the right thing to do, I believe that is the right thing to do, from a genealogical perspective, your reasons have an explanation. Yeah. And an explanation is not a justification. It's just simply, this is the way I came to think the way I am thinking now. And that's just, that's unavoidable.
But at the same time, you can also, I don't think that distinction is that sharp, because you can sometimes when you tell the story of how something came about, happened or took shape, you can also see why certain things internal to that practice emerged that made sense to the participants in that practice. So at a certain point in time, football, say, didn't have an offside rule. Right? Yeah. And people found out we could just kicking the ball around, but it's a problem, right? It's not as fun because people are hanging around in the front and they're waiting for the ball to arrive. Yeah. So we need to come up with something that takes care of that problem. So once we look at how that thing emerged, we see that it was responsive to the kinds of interests that people brought to the table when they came up with that kind of game, and that made up the set of reasons for why they would be inclined to play the game in the first place. And then we see, aha, that's not just some arbitrary rule that's supposed to be difficult to understand to Americans. There's actually a point to that that really cracks open the whole game in a totally different way. And I think that's how it works with morality as well. For instance, punishment it's not just that some people are naturally cruel and like to slaughter people publicly in this big square in Paris. That was the image that I had. But it performs some function in society, and that function is responsive to people's interests and needs to some extent, which also means that when a given social practice ceases to fulfill that function or becomes a burden or becomes something harmful, pressure emerges to renegotiate that function. And we see that, for instance, in order to have people cooperate in Dutch society, we don't need to draw and quarter people on the Dam Square. Right? We have other ways of administering social sanctions and keeping people in line and making them obey the law and so on and so on. We don't need
that. That is because of how that evolution works.
Genau, I'm sorry. Exactly.
It is a good word.
I'm just switching back and forth.
It's perfect, yeah.
Genau. So I think it's not the end of the story, but I think it can give us very important and interesting insights into why did that kind of practice emerge the way that it did? How did it connect to the rest of institutions in society? And also we can see why in some cases it's worth giving up certain institutions. So for instance, there used to be for the longest time a very, very big stigma on premarital sex and illegitimate children, for instance, right? Sure. That used to have some sort of function, right? When you have a society that doesn't really have a kind of social safety net and no idea really for how to deal with single mothers, for instance. I'm not trying to justify that stigma, right? But there is a function that performs, and once you have a society that has outgrown that kind of need, and you tell yourself the story this way, you can see, maybe we should give it up.
Yeah.
But that is this kind of individual reasoning, like the kind of reasoning that individuals understand. So I'm all with you on those kinds of instances. But there is, for instance, an interesting phenomenon that Jonathan Haidt calls moral speechlessness. And the phenomenon is so. Just to give an example that he gives. If you ask the average American, do you think it's morally okay if a brother and sister want to have sex? They take all the necessary precautions. Nobody knows about it. They really want it. Nobody is harmed by this. Absolutely not. Then a huge majority, and the majority gets larger the more you go south in the US. a huge majority says, no, this is not permissible. And it's not just not permissible, it's morally wrong. They call it morally wrong. And when you press them on it, say, explain why this is morally wrong, they give all sorts of weird explanations, but obviously there is no explanation. There is an evolutionary explanation, perfectly, it's actually contested. The evolutionary explanation is contested, so this makes the example slightly, well, perhaps I shouldn't use it, but it's the you can also give other weird examples of people, doing weird stuff to their dead dogs or whatever. It's kinds of actions that people find morally repulsive, but that they really don't have any reasons for in terms of the justification that today we would accept.
But is that then a question of moral, or do people have the wrong conception of what is morality? Well,
there are different opinions on that, but it latches. I mean, it really meshes well with what you call the opacity of certain practices and such. Many societal practices that we have are really beneficial to us, are really useful for us, but we don't know why. And we don't, and that's just an important point.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, okay, so here's an example that I really like. I'm not sure if you mentioned it in the book. So, hunting magic is practiced by many tribes all over the world. Why is it practiced? Well, it's practiced because it works. And you think, wow, hang on, how does that work? Well, it works as follows. You discuss it in the book, it works as follows. It's beneficial for the hunter to be there where the game animal is. It is really beneficial for the game animal to not be there where the hunter is, right? And you can model this in a game called Matching Pennies, which is like you have a euro, I have a euro, we put our euros on the table. If it's heads, I win. If it's heads, tails, or the reverse, you win. So in this case, you're the game animal, I am the hunter, right? So the best way to play this game is to be absolutely, completely, thoroughly random. To show no pattern whatsoever. Human beings are really, really bad at displaying random behavior for good evolutionary reasons. This makes us predictable to other people and thus good collaboration partners. So how do you secure the randomness of the hunter? By using hunting magic. So that's one example of a practice that's really beneficial for a group, but the reasons for which it is beneficial is completely opaque to all the individuals. There are lots of other examples. They're all in the Henrich books, but there are a lot of moral rules that are a bit like that as well, and they don't. I mean, this kind of we all come to see that this is not the right reason and therefore we should change our morality. That I'm all with you there. But for the for the opaque moral reasons, that doesn't work. I mean,
but it's a general phenomenon that we do loads of stuff that we find hard to articulate or describe. Right. So if one of us couldn't walk and you asked me, how do you do it? I could say, well, I wouldn't say the first thing. Right. I could say, well, I just put one foot in front of the other, right? But I had no idea. I couldn't explain to you how I ride a bicycle, right? I teach my kids that the butter that you add to the sauce needs to be really cold, but I don't know why, right? But it has to be, right? Exactly, so there's lots of stuff that is just opaque to us, that is part of our cultural heritage, and our moral norms and values are often like that. And there's this famous experiment that drives people into this state of moral speechlessness or moral dumbfounding, where you ask people, well, what if they agree, brother and sister, to have sex? Is it wrong? And people say, it's wrong. Well, why? Well, because it could lead to disabled children or whatever. That's what people say. But you describe the scenario in a way that precludes that because they use the pill and condoms and so on and so on and so on. So it couldn't really happen. And the question is, what is going on there? And to a large extent, I think it's in a way to be expected that the majority of people wouldn't really know how to articulate the rationale behind the reasons that they avail themselves of, right? So the reason that people have accessible to them is that, well, because incest is wrong, and that's the end of it, right? People don't really know how to follow through that chain of, really deep considerations about, well, why could that be the Westermarck effect, whatever. So that's why people are kind of dumbfounded and speechless and can't really articulate these reasons, even when you press them. But I don't think that really undermines the practice as such. For one thing, it could be that people need to, in order for the practice to perform its very function, people need to believe the story that from the outside we know is kind of false, right? So people need to believe that the magic works, right? You take a piece of wood, you throw it into the fire, there's a pattern that emerges, it tells you we're going to hunt there today. Right? In fact, it's random, and it's a sort of culturally evolved device to generate randomness that our brain cannot generate, because we generate patterns and we see patterns in the world, and that's why it works. But once you were to realize that, you would perhaps become distant from that practice, and you wouldn't want to practice it anymore, right? You're just like, I don't want to do that.
This relates obviously to the intransparency of culture, of cultural practices.
Yeah.
So you say that because I was wondering while you were doing the talk whether it is possible for us to make that culture transparent. But now I'm wondering, is that even something that we should wish for?
Yeah, well, to some extent we can, of course. I'm sure there is an explanation for why the butter needs to be cold. Right? There are lots of these famous detoxification practices. You know, when you process manioc, for instance, you need to do 14 things first in order to make it edible. Right. Otherwise, you very slowly build up, a problematic health condition. The people who do it have no idea, because it was built over centuries and millennia. They have no idea what's going on. After a certain point, it's possible, like, that's what's going on, and there's this chemical that builds up, and that's why we need to detoxify it in a certain way. But once things become more complex, usually we don't know how things really work.
Should we want to know, or?
Well, it depends. Sometimes it can be that an institution would be fine if we found out what the hidden imperatives are that make it work. Sometimes it could be that we become dissatisfied, and we would then, once we know what makes it work, we would sort of make the measure the target. Right? There's this sort of famous line that once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure. Once you start aiming for the thing that used to be operating behind your back, maybe you become bad at it. For instance, once a government starts to measure how different pupils in different schools fare in terms of grades, but once the teachers find out that that's what the government measures, they're going to teach for the grade.
Right. Yes.
Right? And not really for the content that then, as a side effect, delivers the grade. For another example from the education system, perhaps, is a big part of university degrees, for instance, a big part at least, is not that people learn that much. It's more like a 4-year-long personality and IQ test. Right? It's just like the kind of person that can get that degree is the kind of person that's kind of smart and can tolerate boredom. Right? Which means it's the perfect employee, right? It's exactly the kind of person that you want to hire.
That's quite pessimistic.
So even if you teach nothing at all at university, you would still send that signal to employers that would make university degrees and university education a useful thing to do. But once you make that explicit, and a lot of people find out about it, the whole practice could change or unravel in certain ways that maybe would be beneficial, maybe would be detrimental, but it would change the practice in a sort of unforeseeable ways that can't really be anticipated. So you have that separation between the function something performs and the reasons that people who are involved in that kind of institutions appreciate and articulate, and they may or may not be part of the real explanation or not. And in some cases, it may be useful for people to believe in those sorts of reasons in order for that institution to keep performing its function. So it's a bit of a tricky.
It is.
Again,
Why is morality sort of not like that?
I think it is.
Yeah, and that means that we're back with the question of how does explanation relate to justification? Because now you're basically saying, okay, so our moral justifications might actually be sort of opaque explanations of why society works for us.
Yeah.
And I agree that it is probably like this, right? And a lot of our morality is probably opaque to us. It's not really clear to us why it works the way it does, but it does work.
Yeah.
Why does it work? Well, because we're pretty successful in our societies. That's ultimately the criteria.
Yeah. And but I do think that precisely that kind of interaction between the causal explanation and the internal normative perspective can sometimes help us adjust details of the normative justification that may go awry.
But it might also destroy it.
It cuts both ways. It cuts both ways. But let me give another example. There's this the different moral theories. One famous one is utilitarianism, and the big problem is that it seems to allow you to do horrible things for the greater good.
Right. So, if just in short, it means that what you should chase is as many happiness as possible, as much happiness as possible.
So, should you, if the mob will burn down the town unless you frame this innocent person for rape, right, should you do it? More people will die.
Yeah.
Right? Those kinds of conflicts. There is a similar analog in a different moral theory, which is, a more Kantian, a more principle-based approach that doesn't allow these sorts of trade-offs, which is that sometimes the theory becomes too rigorous. It becomes fetishistic about the rules that it recommends. And the famous example is Kant's short essay. There's a group of thugs. You're hiding someone, right? In your house, there's a group of thugs trying to apprehend that person, and they want to murder the person. And the question is, can you lie to the thugs at the door? Can you lie to the murderers at the door? And if you think that lying is always impermissible, you need to tell the truth, right? That seems weird, right? Yeah. And I think once we understand why lying and trust in general would play such an important part in our normative infrastructure, precisely because we are social beings, precisely because we are so dependent on accepting information from other people on the basis of trust that we cannot scrutinize ourselves, right? That's what makes that so morally important. And once we know that story about what the real function is that this prohibition against lying performs, we can see that, okay, that's why we need to take it extra seriously that we're not supposed to lie. Right. And that's the thing that makes us sort of go overboard in the murder at the door case, right? So, but in order for that prohibition on lying to function, we need to take it extra seriously. It's just that, a stepmotherly nature, so to speak, sometimes can bring up situations where sticking to that rule and continuing to take it extra seriously can lead to these bad effects. And once we tell that story of where this deep moralization of truth-telling and lying, where that originates and where that came from in the first place, I think that allows us to have at least some input into re-evaluating the strictness of the prohibition against lying, for instance.
So,
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
May I?
One last small thing until I want to move on to the next.
I want. Okay, so then maybe this is a move to next topic. So, how does moral philosophy fit in with this whole story? Because this is. I like what you're saying about lying to the thugs at the door. That sounds very plausible to me. And it also sounds like moral philosophy to me. But what does the moral philosophy do? I mean, you present a huge history, a massive history of the origins of morality. And for some reason, none of the origins of, moral thinking, pro-sociality, moral transformations, whatever, none of these contain a wise philosopher who says, listen, folks, we ought to behave in this way, and everybody's saying, oh, yeah, that's a good idea, let's do that. It doesn't work that way. So then the question is, what is the function of moral philosophy, really? Is moral philosophy, do we really, is this really about what we should do? Or is do moral philosophers do what you just did, which is to try to articulate the reasons that we actually already have due to our evolutionary past? Is that what moral philosophers do?
Yeah, I think, a big part of the answer could just be that most moral philosophy is just false.
I agree.
And I do think
but I'm not a moral philosopher, so I can.
There have been all these, Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and so on and so on and so on, all the big guys. I think they were saying false things. Yeah. And they came up with a story about why you're supposed to do that and not supposed to do that. And I think these stories are not very convincing. And I reckon that you agree with much of what I just said. Yes. Yes, I think what moral philosophers do, and it's partially valuable, it's a kind of modest thing to say. But what moral philosophers do is I think they articulate the most fine-grained details of the normative infrastructure that we have inherited that does a certain thing, and sort of goes through really sort of the capillaries of that kind of infrastructure, and really tries to think it through. Also, we can notice certain tensions in our thinking about things. It seems that, for instance, we don't have any real reason to think that belonging to the human species is something that is especially important, right? Why would it just so happen to be the case that the only types of beings that deserve moral consideration in the world just happen to overlap completely with the human species, right? That's very strange. It's very convenient, right? That it just so happens that the species that we care most about by far is the only one that deserves moral consideration. And then people can think through, okay, what are the reasons for why we privilege a certain type of species in our actions? And after a couple of years or decades, you find that you come up pretty much empty-handed, and you see, I guess nothing privileges that kind of speciesism in favor of only humanity. So I think there is some function to.
How do you look at that from an evolutionary point of view? Because I always find that, so if you have an evolutionary take on the origins of morality, basically you would have to say that morality is good for your species, for your procreation, and that's all you should care about. But apparently we have come up with kind of morality that's also concerned with other kinds of animals. How does that?
That is a current discussion, a current controversy. I don't have a firm view on that, but I think in general, when we look at the history of human morality, we see that it is a history of expanding cooperative circles and including more and more members in our collaborative efforts. And it makes no sense in the way in which taking care of your own kids makes sense, because you're taking care of your own genes, sort of copies of your own genes in your kids, right? Not in that sense, but usually we do better and we thrive more when we have a wider circle of people that we have in the boat of cooperation, even when they're not related. And that can make sense because it benefits us. It allows us to come up with new innovations, new knowledge that then lead to these effects, and so on and so on and so on. And I think it's, like I said, it's a live and ongoing question of what grounds human sympathy for the other creatures, because from a species point of view, it's a bit of a puzzle. It could be that we also have a long history of living together with animals. They also benefit us, so the same kinds of... There is a kind of reciprocity between humans and animals.
But it might also be a side effect, right?
Yeah.
I mean, why not? I mean, it's evolutionary profitable to be pro-social in general, so everyone who's pro-social tends to procreate better, and then that pro-sociality sort of spills over to the animals. Why not? Why doesn't?
Could be. It could be that we have this thing for very young looking faces, right? Big eyes,
we do,
and so on and so on. And there are a couple of animals. They're pretty cute, right? A very young dog it just happens to have these features as well, right?
Yeah.
Plus it has the fur and it's fluffy and so on and on. It's perfect.
We also care for pigs.
Exactly. Yeah, but it could be just some sort of thing that makes sense over there, and it just happens to apply also in this other case. But I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure. There are also, I think the big lesson is what you said is there are all sorts of puzzles in our behavior where it's not immediately obvious why something could evolve, right? Like, wouldn't that be punished to care a lot about animals? That makes no sense, right? But also the history of evolutionary theory has often shown, I think, that we discover after a while a hidden mechanism that makes this pay off in some indirect way. And it could be that there is such a mechanism in the case of sympathy for animals as well, but I'm not sure.
All this evolution, what does that say about the current state of our moral debate? We feel like things are changing, but you said we're coming to a sort of a halt. I feel like evolution sometimes feels like something that is unstoppable. It's like the kind of the basic of our being. now we seem to have grinded to a halt.
Yeah. I think mostly so when you look at the kinds of terms that are floating around when people talk about the current moral zeitgeist, so to speak.
Sure.
People talk a lot about identity and group membership, for instance. People talk about cancel culture. People talk about inequality and oppression, and so on and so on. And I wanted to narrate the story of all of these elements, paint a picture of how they all combine in new and fresh ways, and how our inherited evolved psychology sometimes gets the better of us. And all of a sudden, you have divisions between ethnicities reanimated, because it's very, very easy to reinvigorate hostility between people that kind of look a bit different, right? Because we are built that way. And that's why it's useful, I think, to tell a story of why that happens and why that happens so easily. And once you know that story, you can also think, I guess I'm just sort of falling prey to this mistake or this illusion again.
So we're making it kind of transparent in a way, why that happens.
But it also, I think very often you hear usually people think like right now that's the biggest crisis ever. Right.
Sure.
And so cancel culture is, wild and people lose their jobs over this and that. But once we see that these elements are all very old, we also have some insight into, no, this is actually normal. It's just that under current conditions, we get the same kind of mix in a different shape. And there isn't anything that special about this moment other than that. We have especially large societies, we have social media, we have environmental crises perhaps to deal with. And that's also a big, supposed to be a big lesson of the book, which is that, like I said, I think that by and large, humans thrive more and do better when they cooperate at larger scales in a more inclusive and egalitarian way. And we see right now that we have, for the first time in history, really built a truly global species. But a truly global species is also going to be a species that creates global problems. Yeah. And so we are now on sort of facing that challenge right now of, will we succeed in scaling up our cooperative efforts once again in order to build the global geopolitical and moral structures that allow us to deal with environmental regulation and so on and so on and so on. And we'll see.
It's the fight for who gets to ask the next question. Very shortly, very briefly.
On this, because I agree with you that Henrik's book on weird people is absolutely brilliant and everybody should read it. But the world consists, weird culture is the dominant culture on Earth. And then so the global collaboration that you just sketched is a weird collaboration. How do Largely, yeah. So how do we include non-Western societies, or societies that are based on kinship structures, which do have different moral systems altogether? Their moral systems are less individualistic, for instance.
That's right.
And that makes a huge. It really makes it difficult to. So I want to believe you.
Yeah.
But I find it hard to see how the non-weird cultures would fit into this global collaboration.
Yeah, it can be a very slow and incremental process, but I think we do see one thing, for instance, is that these weird places are the places that people want to go to. Right, so even people North Koreans need to be prevented from leaving. Right, they would love to, go to the Netherlands, for good reason, because it's much better here. Of course, North Korea is a bit of an extreme example. I take that back a little bit, but just to highlight the enormous difference. It's really very different there from here. But you have other society. I think the important point to highlight is that this weird Western stuff is not a permanent division. This place used to be not weird, right? Not so long ago. So apparently, it doesn't take a different kind of genetic, ethnicity or something to
but it does take the breakdown of kinship structures. That's very important.
It does and take often very, very elaborate changes to, but not always. For instance, Japan made a conscious effort in the Meiji Restoration to import or to do their best at modernizing and to consciously break down kinship and nepotism as the organizing principles of how society is run, clans and tribes and so on and so on, very roughly speaking. And it worked for them by recreating and remodeling certain aspects of how a modern society has to function. And I think in principle, we do see that for all the ills that modern economic growth has brought, it also brings many benefits, but for all the problems that this and pathologies that this creates, you see that there are a lot of people who would be quite keen to participate in a similar set of institutions, not the same perhaps, with different cultural quirks and idiosyncrasies and so on and so on, but they would in principle like to live in a world that is freer and more prosperous. And you just don't get to do that unless you adopt a certain set of institutions, for instance. You don't get to do that without, at some point, granting certain freedoms to individuals. You don't get to do that without, at a certain point, granting certain freedoms of speech and press and so on and so on and so on. And that is what many places that would like to modernize run up against now, because they see, we have a growing middle class and they demand certain things, but we don't want to give it to them.
Isn't there a danger of colonialism here, and like a sort of mental colonialism?
Yeah, that's the thing that I get very often, and I think there is a danger. I don't think it's inherent in the story, because for one thing, I don't think there are any arguments in there that suggest that that kind of idea should be violently coerced on people, right? So it should not be brought to. It's not like the white man should bring the good news to the world. Sure. That's certainly not a good idea for all sorts of reasons. It's both economically, morally, politically, it just doesn't work, and it's just a bad idea. So there's no such recommendation at all. But I do think that. This goes back to the relativism point. I do think that we often exaggerate the extent to which human interests are really different across cultures. I think in many cases what we see is that cultures appear to be different, but really they are different. But a big part of what we have is that we have an extractive elite structure that really oppresses the rest of society, and people would in fact like to have more freedoms, more participation, more room for just doing what they want and living as they please. It's just they are prevented from doing so, because that's how it's been for almost all of history in almost all places.
Yeah, but I'm going to cut off the discussion, because otherwise we have no other time.
Final blow. I think that's a big reason. That's a big reason why we shouldn't buy into this strong type of moral relativism, because it is a service towards authoritarian leaders who don't want to get criticized for what they do. Right?
I think that is a perfect. I was going to ask you for a takeaway message from the book, but that's the one. That's the one.